I won $120 million in the lottery. After years of being treated like an absolute burden by my own flesh and blood, I decided to run a final test on my family. I called them desperately begging for $300 for life-saving medication. My older sister immediately hung up on me because she was too busy shopping for a luxury gown. My mother told me to figure it out because my sickness was not her problem. But my younger brother drove 200 miles with the last $50 to his name just to make sure I could breathe. What I did next changed the trajectory of our entire bloodline. Before I tell you how I dismantled their fake lives piece by piece, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your own peace. The heat inside the kitchen of La Petite Maison was absolutely suffocating. I stood over a massive industrial stove, my white chef coat clinging to my back with sweat-hot grease splattering against my bare forearms. As a sous chef at a restaurant that was barely clinging to life, I was used to the relentless daily grind. But today was different. My chest was unbearably tight. Every single breath felt like I was trying to inhale through a crushed plastic straw. My asthma was flaring up violently, and my rescue inhaler was completely empty. My vision started to blur at the edges as I stepped away from the line, ignoring the loud shouting of the head chef. I pushed through the swinging doors and stumbled into the narrow, cramped, dry storage pantry to make a phone call I prayed I would not regret. I pulled out my phone with trembling flour-covered fingers and dialed my older sister, Ebony. She answered on the fourth ring, and immediately I could hear the sound of clinking champagne glasses and the rustling of expensive fabrics in the background. I gasped for air, leaning my heavy body against a metal shelf of canned tomatoes, and begged her for a quick loan of $300 so I could go to an emergency urgent care clinic and get a prescription. Her sharp, condescending laugh pierced right through the phone speaker, making my heart sink. "Are you serious right now, Octavia?" Ebony scoffed, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. "I am standing in the middle of an exclusive downtown boutique getting fitted for a $3,000 custom gown for the annual church gala. My husband Spencer is waiting outside in the luxury SUV, and you are calling me to beg for pocket change." I closed my eyes tightly, a single tear cutting a path through the flour on my cheek. I pleaded with her, reminding her that I physically could not breathe, that it was a literal medical emergency, and I would pay her back as soon as possible. "You breathing is not my financial responsibility," she snapped back coldly. "Maybe if you did not let yourself go, if you lost some of that weight, and actually kept a real corporate job, instead of flipping burgers in a greasy kitchen, you could afford your own basic medicine. Stop breathing my air with your poverty." "Octavia, I have real important people to network with tonight, and you are ruining my mood." The line went dead. There was no hesitation, no concern for her younger sister gasping for air in a hot pantry. Just the cold, hard click of an ended call. I stared at the darkened phone screen, my hands shaking uncontrollably as my lungs burned desperately for oxygen. I wiped my face with the back of my sweaty sleeve and pulled up the contact for my mother, Geraldine. If there was anyone on this earth who was supposed to care about my physical well-being, it was the woman who gave birth to me. She was the head of finance at the largest megachurch in Atlanta, a woman who prided herself on her highly publicized image of Christian charity and endless grace. The phone rang for what felt like an eternity before she finally picked up. Her tone was instantly sharp and impatient. "What is it now?" "Octavia, I am right in the middle of balancing the sanctuary expansion budget for the pastor." I struggled to speak, my voice a pathetic wheeze, as I explained that Ebony had just turned me down and I desperately needed $300 for an emergency asthma inhaler. I promised her I would pay her back on Friday, the very second my paycheck cleared the bank. A heavy, incredibly judgmental sigh echoed through the receiver. "Figure it out yourself, Octavia," my mother said, her voice completely devoid of any maternal warmth. "You being sick is not my problem. You are 32 years old, and you are still begging your family for handouts like a child. If you had not dropped out of culinary school all those years ago, you would not be in this pathetic mess right now. You would be a head chef somewhere respectable instead of a glorified line cook begging for pennies. I clutched my chest, trying forcefully to pull air into my restricted lungs. I tried to remind her between ragged gasps that I only dropped out of culinary school because she outright refused to co-sign my student loan, choosing instead to drain her savings to pay for Ebony's lavish destination wedding in the Bahamas. That is ancient history, and you know it, my mother snapped, completely dismissing my pain and rewriting the past as she always did. You always play the victim when things get hard. I have hundreds of thousands of dollars of the Lord's money to manage right now. I cannot be distracted by your poor life choices and your chronic lack of planning. Pray on it, Octavia. Ask God to grant you some financial responsibility. Do not dare call me again while I am doing the Lord's accounting. The dial tone hummed in my ear, somehow louder than the clattering pots and pans in the kitchen outside. The message was loud and undeniably clear. To my own mother and my sister, I was not family. I was a stain on their pristine, carefully curated image. I was an embarrassment they preferred to keep hidden in the shadows, where no one from their country club or their church could see me. I stumbled out of this kitchen pantry, pushing my body weight against the heavy back doors and collapsing into the alleyway. The humid Atlanta afternoon air hit me like a brick wall. I fell onto a stack of dirty plastic milk crates, right next to the dumpster, clutching my chest, genuinely wondering if I was going to pass out on the concrete. Just as the edges of my vision started to go completely black, a beat-up silver Honda Civic came screeching around the corner of the building, its worn brake pads squealing loudly against the pavement. The car jerked to a violent halt right in front of me and the driver's side door flew open. Jamal, my 28-year-old brother, practically fell out of the vehicle. He was still wearing his bright red logistics delivery uniform, his forehead shining with sweat in the brutal heat. Jamal was the only person in this entire toxic family who truly understood the struggle. He worked as a delivery driver during the day and picked up shifts as a waiter at night, constantly drowning in his own massive student debt, but he had a heart of pure, unfiltered gold. He rushed over and dropped to his knees right there on the filthy concrete alley floor. He reached into his uniform pocket with shaking hands and pulled out a single severely crumpled $50 bill. He shoved it forcefully into my hands, his eyes wide with panic and fierce protective love. I canceled my double shift and drove 200 miles straight from my delivery route, he said, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. It is all I have to my name right now, sis. It is my gas money and my grocery money for the week, but I do not care. Take it. Go to the pharmacy right now and beg them for a partial refill. Go get your inhaler. Please, Octavia, just take it. I looked down at the crumpled bill resting in my sweaty palm, then up at his exhausted, terrified face. While our mother was fiercely guarding the church's millions to boost her own ego, and our sister was buying a $3,000 dress to impress people who did not care about her, my baby brother had raced across the state to give me his literal last dollar. He was willing to walk to work and go hungry for a week, just to make sure his big sister could take a breath of air. The emotional dam completely broke. I pulled him forward into a tight, desperate embrace, burying my face in his sweaty delivery uniform, crying real heavy tears. They were not tears of sorrow or self-pity, but tears of overwhelming, profound gratitude. "Thank you, Jamal," I whispered against his shoulder, my voice cracking with emotion. "You have absolutely no idea what you just did for me." Jamal hugged me back fiercely, completely unbothered by the grease and flour coating my chef coat. He stayed sitting on those milk crates with me until my breathing finally steadied, making me promise, looking him in the eye, that I would go straight to the clinic the moment he left. Once he finally got back into his battered Honda and drove off to figure out where he was going to sleep before his next grueling shift, I stood up. I wiped my face completely clean of tears, using the hem of my apron. The tightness in my chest was still lingering, but a brand new blazing energy coursed through my veins. I walked back into the restaurant, completely ignoring the shouting head chef, who demanded to know where I had been, and walked straight past the kitchen line into the employee bathroom. I locked the heavy wooden door behind me, the deadbolt clicking loudly in the quiet space, and leaned against the ceramic sink. I reached deep into the breast pocket of my uniform and pulled out a slightly damp, neatly folded piece of paper. It was a lottery ticket I had bought 2 days ago at a gas station on a total whim. My hands, which had been shaking uncontrollably from lack of oxygen just moments before, were completely steady now. I pulled out my phone connected to the spotty restaurant Wi-Fi and loaded the official state lottery website. I looked at the winning numbers posted brightly on the screen. Then I looked down at my ticket. The first number was a perfect match. The second number another match. The third, the fourth, the fifth. All a flawless, impossible match. My eyes darted to the Powerball number. It stared back at me, identical to the red circled number on my phone screen. The total prize amount flashed in bold, unmistakable letters at the top of the web page. $120 million. I gripped the edges of the porcelain sink so hard my knuckles turned white and stared at my reflection in the smudged, water-spotted mirror. I did not scream. I did not jump up and down or drop to the floor. I just stared at the woman looking back at me under the flickering fluorescent bathroom light. A woman who had just been completely dismissed, deemed unworthy of a simple $300 lifeline by the very people who shared her blood. A woman who had been mocked for her struggles, belittled for her appearance, and treated like an unwanted, embarrassing burden for her entire life. I thought about Ebony bragging about her fake luxury lifestyle and her important networking events while blatantly refusing to help her own sister breathe. I thought about my mother hiding behind her religious titles and her church finances to mask her deeply cruel, uncharitable heart. And then I thought about Jamal, my sweet, exhausted brother driving 200 miles in a broken-down car just to give me the very last $50 in his pocket. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face, changing my entire demeanor. The scared, struggling sous chef was gone. I folded the ticket carefully, slid it back into my pocket, and patted it flat against my chest. "Let the games begin," I whispered to the empty room. The morning sun glared off the towering glass skyscrapers of downtown Atlanta as I stepped out of the rideshare. I was still wearing a pair of faded black slacks and a cheap gray sweater that smelled faintly of stale frying oil from the restaurant. My hands were trembling, completely tucked deep into my pockets, where my fingers traced the sharp edges of the paper that was about to change my entire existence. I walked into the lobby of the most elite wealth management law firm in the state. The receptionist, a woman in an immaculate tailored suit, looked me up and down with barely concealed disdain. Her eyes lingered on my scuffed, non-slip work shoes before she asked if I was lost. I did not raise my voice. I simply gave her my name and told her I had a scheduled consultation with Marcus Vance, their senior managing partner. She tapped at her keyboard, her condescending smile freezing instantly as she saw the account details flag on her screen. Within 30 seconds, I was being escorted into a private soundproof elevator that shot up to the top floor of the building. The conference room was massive, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a sprawling view of the city I had struggled in for my entire adult life. Marcus Vance was a sharp, calculating man in his late 50s. He did not look at my clothes or judge my appearance. He only looked at the lottery ticket I slid across the polished mahogany table. He verified the numbers, his professional demeanor never breaking, and immediately began laying out the architecture of my new reality. We spent the first 2 hours establishing an airtight blind trust. I named it Apex Holdings. The primary directive I gave him was total and absolute anonymity. No one under any circumstances could ever trace this money back to Octavia. I knew my family. I knew the specific predatory brand of greed that pulsed through their veins. If my mother or my sister found out I had won $120 million, they would not just ask for a handout. They would demand the entire fortune. They would drag me into court, claiming I owed them for the years of shelter they begrudgingly provided when I was a child. They would bleed me completely dry, and then complain that I did not give them enough. Marcus handed me a heavy gold pen to sign the final formation documents. As the ink set on the thick paper, a profound sense of relief washed over me, immediately followed by the sobering weight of what came next. Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers together. He explained that to fully insulate my new wealth, his investigative team needed to conduct a comprehensive background and liability check on all my immediate family members. He told me that sudden wealth often acts like a magnet for hidden legal liabilities, and if my mother or sister had any outstanding lawsuits, predatory debts, or criminal financial exposures, those creditors might attempt to pierce the corporate veil of my trust to get to my money. I gave him the authorization to run the checks, assuming the worst he would find would be some unpaid credit cards from my sister Ebony's shopping habits. I sat in the plush leather chair sipping sparkling water while his team worked in the background. When Marcus returned to the conference room an hour later, his expression had shifted from professional courtesy to genuine grave concern. He carried a thick manila folder and placed it squarely in front of me. He told me that what his team uncovered was not a standard liability. It was a massive, highly illegal financial crater that threatened to destroy the one thing in this world I actually cared about. I opened the folder, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon until a specific address jumped off the page and punched the air right out of my lungs. It was Big Mama Ruby's house. The house was a modest, beautiful Victorian on a quiet, tree-lined street in Decatur. It was the only place I had ever felt safe. Big Mama Ruby was the only person who never commented on my weight, never told me I was a failure, and never compared me to Ebony. When I was a little girl sitting on her wraparound porch snapping green beans, she would hold my face and tell me I had a spirit made of pure gold. Before she passed away suddenly from a stroke 5 years ago, she had pulled me close to her hospital bed and told me the house was mine. It was a verbal promise, witnessed by no one but God and the beeping heart monitor. But because there was no updated written will, the state law dictated that her next of kin, my mother Geraldine, inherited the property. Geraldine had looked me in the eye at the funeral and promised she would keep the house safe, treating it as a sacred family heirloom. I looked down at the documents Marcus had highlighted. Attached to the deed of Big Mama Ruby's fully paid-off house was a massive high-interest predatory mortgage lien. The property had been leveraged to the absolute maximum limit. My hands started to shake, not from fear this time, but from a deep, boiling rage. I asked Marcus to explain exactly what I was looking at. He walked me through the paper trail with surgical precision. Geraldine had not just taken out a small loan against the property. She had orchestrated a complex series of fraudulent filings, essentially forging documents to bypass the standard probate restrictions, and drained the entire equity of the house. The loan terms were catastrophic. It was the kind of desperate, toxic debt that loan sharks offered to people who had exhausted every other legal financial avenue. The interest rates were astronomical, designed to ensure the borrower could never actually pay down the principal. But the most horrifying part was not the debt itself. It was where the money had gone. Marcus showed me the wire transfer logs. The funds had not been used for a family emergency or a medical crisis. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been funneled directly from the bank into a series of shell checking accounts. Marcus traced those accounts directly to Spencer, my sister Ebony's husband. Spencer, the arrogant finance bro who constantly belittled me for smelling like a commercial kitchen, was a complete fraud. The money my mother extracted from Big Mama Ruby's legacy had been used entirely to fund their fake luxury lifestyle. It paid for the lease on Ebony's Porsche. It paid for the absurd rent on their McMansion that they pretended to own on social media. It paid for the designer bags Ebony flaunted at church. And worst of all, it was being used to cover massive, devastating losses from Spencer's failing day trading investments. The betrayal was so profound it physically hurt. My mother, the head of finance at the largest megachurch in the city, the woman who constantly preached about financial responsibility and divine morality, had illegally mortgaged her own dead mother's home. She had risked the only true piece of generational wealth our family had ever owned, the roof Big Mama Ruby built with her own 2 hands, just to finance Ebony's superficial country club facade. Geraldine had thrown away the only place I ever felt loved, just so her favorite daughter could pretend to be wealthy on the internet. They had sold my grandmother's memory for leased luxury cars and expensive brunches. And now, according to the documents spread across the mahogany table, the house was drowning. The payments were severely delinquent. Marcus looked at me with a quiet professional sympathy. He saw the tears of anger welling in my eyes and clearly misunderstood my silence for despair. He gently explained that the primary lender was preparing to initiate foreclosure proceedings. Within a matter of weeks, the bank would seize the property, auction it off to the highest bidder, and Big Mama Ruby's legacy would be erased completely. Geraldine, Ebony, and Spencer would lose the collateral, and the house would be gone forever. Marcus tapped his pen against the legal pad, offering a swift and simple solution. He told me that since we were establishing the blind trust today, he could easily authorize a quiet, anonymous wire transfer to the lender. He asked if I wanted him to simply pay off the lien entirely. He said we could clear the debt, secure the deed free and clear, and save the family home without any of them ever knowing I was the one who rescued them. It would be a drop in the bucket of my new fortune. A simple clerical action to fix my mother's catastrophic greed. I sat perfectly still, staring at the signature of my mother on the fraudulent loan application. A signature that represented decades of neglect, of being treated like a servant, of being told I was a failure, while they secretly stole from the dead to fund their illusions. I thought about Ebony laughing at me while I was having an asthma attack, telling me I was breathing her air with my poverty. I thought about Geraldine telling me to figure it out because my sickness was not her problem. I processed the absolute depth of their betrayal, and the lingering sorrow in my chest evaporated, replaced entirely by a cold, calculating resolve. I did not want to save them. I wanted to teach them exactly what it felt like to be entirely at the mercy of someone who did not care about their survival. I slowly looked up from the documents and met Marcus's gaze. My voice was eerily calm, devoid of any warmth or hesitation. "No," I said, leaning forward in the heavy leather chair. "Do not pay it off. Do not save them. I want you to contact the primary lender immediately. I want Apex Holdings to buy the debt in its entirety. I want to own the lien. I want to own my mother's mortgage. I want to be the bank." Marcus paused, his pen hovering over the legal pad, a look of profound realization crossing his features as he understood exactly what kind of power I was claiming. He nodded once, a sharp, respectful gesture, and began writing the acquisition orders that would place the noose directly around my family's necks. The blazing Atlanta sun beat down heavily on the cracked windshield of my dented sedan as I pulled up to the wrought iron gates of the sprawling suburban estate. Ebony and Spencer called it their sanctuary, but I knew it was just another stage for their endless, exhausting performance. The long, curving driveway was already lined with gleaming luxury vehicles, Range Rovers and imported sedans, creating a stark contrast to my fading paint job and rattling engine. I parked my car near the street, purposely keeping my distance from the leased silver Porsche sitting proudly by the front double doors. I was still wearing my white chef coat from the morning shift, complete with flour stains, grease splatters, and the lingering heavy scent of chopped onions and commercial fryers. I did not change my clothes because keeping my cover meant playing the exact role they expected of me. I had to remain the tired, broke sister who was always one step behind and struggling to survive. The heavy bass of an outdoor sound system throbbed through the perfectly manicured hedges as I walked through the side gate toward the backyard. It was their monthly Sunday barbecue, an event designed purely for Ebony to flaunt her supposed wealth to her fellow church members and for Spencer to brag endlessly to his finance friends. The humidity was thick, making my chef coat stick to my shoulders, but a strange sense of calm had settled over my entire body. I had just left the high-power legal office downtown, where I secured $120 million in a blind trust. I knew all their secrets now. I knew about the massive hidden debts, the impending foreclosure, and the embezzlement. I knew the ground beneath their feet was completely hollow. I had barely stepped onto the travertine patio when Spencer spotted me. He was wearing crisp white linen pants and a pastel polo shirt, holding a crystal glass of expensive bourbon. He cut through a group of his laughing friends and marched straight toward me, holding a pair of greasy barbecue tongs. Before I could even say hello, he shoved the filthy metal tongs right into my chest, forcing me to grab them quickly to keep from ruining my coat entirely. "Here, chef," he said, his voice loud enough for the people nearby to stop and listen. "Go flip the ribs they are burning, and do me a favor. Try not to sweat too close to the pool. My golf buddies are coming over soon, and they are not really used to the smell of a commercial kitchen." I stood there gripping the greasy metal, feeling the eyes of his friends burning into my back as they chuckled at his cruel little joke. A week ago, a comment like that would have sent me running to the bathroom to cry. I would have internalized the shame, shrinking myself down to fit into the tiny, pathetic box they built for me. But today my heart beat with a slow, steady rhythm. I looked at Spencer, taking in his smug smile and his flashy watch. I just smiled politely, turned around, and walked over to the massive outdoor grill. The heat radiating from the grill was intense, but I focused on the task, flipping the ribs and watching the thick smoke billow up into the clear blue sky. From my spot in the corner, I had a perfect vantage point of the entire party. Ebony was holding court by the edge of the infinity pool, posing for a barrage of photos. She was wearing a flowing silk caftan, holding a prop glass of champagne, laughing loudly as her friends angled their phones to capture the expansive house behind her. She kept loudly referring to the property as her little piece of heaven, and talking about the exhausting demands of being a luxury homeowner. It was a masterclass in delusion. She was a realtor who had not sold a house in 8 months, staging fake success on a property she was currently 3 months behind on renting. After a while, Spencer sauntered over to the grill area, flanked by 2 of his finance friends. He wanted to show off the expensive cuts of meat he had supposedly ordered from a high-end butcher. He leaned against the stone counter, looking me up and down with that familiar condescending smirk. "You know, Octavia," he said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You really should watch your portion sizes around this meat. Not everyone can afford the grind right. Some people are just born to serve, and some are born to build empires. You have to accept your lot in life." His friends chuckled, sipping their drinks and shaking their heads. I kept my eyes on the grill, flipping a particularly charred piece of meat. "You seem to know a lot about building empires, Spencer," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of emotion. He puffed out his chest, adjusting his collar and taking a sip of his bourbon. "It takes a certain kind of mindset, Octavia," he said. "Something they do not teach you while you are scrubbing pots. It takes risk-taking, financial literacy, and knowing how to leverage assets. You would not understand the pressure of managing real wealth." The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. This man was lecturing me on financial literacy while secretly draining my deceased grandmother's equity to pay off his fraudulent debts. He was standing in a house he was about to be evicted from, lecturing a woman who had just put more money into a bank account than he would see in 10 lifetimes. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling. I just nodded, playing the part of the uneducated sister. "You are absolutely right, Spencer," I murmured, keeping my head down. "I could never understand your kind of financial leverage." He patted my shoulder patronizingly, a heavy hand that made my skin crawl. "Exactly," he said. "Stick to the kitchen, Octavia. Leave the big moves to the adults." A sharp clinking sound echoed across the patio, suddenly silencing the chatter of the crowd. My mother Geraldine stood on the raised terrace overlooking the pool, tapping a silver spoon against a champagne flute. She wore a tailored church suit, her hair perfectly styled, projecting the image of a devout, deeply blessed matriarch. She commanded the attention of the 80 guests with practiced ease. "Family and friends," she began, her voice projecting across the quieted yard. "Today is a special day. We are gathered here not just to enjoy the blessings the Lord has poured over my beautiful daughter Ebony and her wonderful husband Spencer, but to celebrate the legacy of our family." My chest tightened instantly. I knew that tone. It was the exact tone she used right before she did something incredibly cruel under the guise of family tradition. I put down the tongs and stepped away from the grill, wiping my hands on a towel. Geraldine reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a worn velvet jewelry box. The moment I saw it, my breath hitched in my throat. It was the box that held Big Mama Ruby's vintage pearl necklace. Those pearls were the only thing of value my grandmother possessed. Before she died, she used to let me try them on, telling me that one day when I found my path, they would belong to me. It was a sacred promise, the only piece of genuine, unconditional love I had to hold on to in this entire family. Geraldine opened the box, the sunlight catching the creamy luster of the heavy pearls. As the matriarch of this family, it is my duty to pass down our history to the one who truly represents our highest values. She announced, her eyes sweeping over the crowd and completely ignoring me, standing by the smoke of the grill. "Ebony, come here, my sweet girl," she called out. Ebony feigned a gasp of surprise, covering her mouth with her manicured hands as she hurried up the steps to stand beside our mother. Geraldine carefully lifted the pearls from the velvet cushion and placed them around Ebony's neck, fastening the clasp with dramatic flair. The crowd applauded softly, admiring the heirloom. I could not stay silent. The deep injustice of it burned through my veins, overriding my desire to lay low and observe. "Wait," I said, my voice carrying across the patio, cutting through the polite applause. "Mom, Big Mama Ruby promised those to me. She told both of us they were mine." The applause died instantly. 80 pairs of eyes turned to look at the overweight, flour-stained cook standing by the barbecue grill. The silence was absolute and suffocating. Geraldine looked down at me from the terrace, her expression hardening into a mask of pure disgust. She did not flinch or look embarrassed. Instead, she leaned into the microphone. "Do not be ridiculous, Octavia," she sneered, her voice dripping with classist contempt. "Pearls belong on a woman driving a Porsche, not on a woman taking the city bus smelling like fried food. What exactly are you going to wear these with your stained chef coat? These are for a woman of status, a woman who upholds the family name, not a college dropout who can barely afford her own asthma medication." The crowd murmured uncomfortably, some looking away in pity, while others whispered to each other behind their hands. Ebony touched the pearls, posing for another photo and letting out a soft, mocking laugh. "Know your place, Octavia," she said sweetly, her voice carrying over the crowd. "You are embarrassing Mom in front of the guests." I stood there, absorbing the sheer venom of their public humiliation. They had stolen the house, they had stolen the legacy, and now they were stealing the only physical memory I had left of the one person who ever truly loved me. I looked at my mother's cold, judgmental eyes and felt the last remaining thread of my familial loyalty snap and wither away completely. I did not owe these people anything anymore. Ebony clapped her hands together, drawing the attention back to herself. "Anyway," she chirped, completely ignoring the devastating scene that had just unfolded, "we have even more exciting news to share today. Spencer, get up here, baby." Spencer jogged up the stone steps, wrapping his arm around Ebony's waist, looking out at the crowd like a conquering king. Ebony beamed, holding her champagne glass high in the air. "I want everyone to raise a glass to my amazing husband," she said. As of tomorrow, Spencer is officially leaving his current firm to accept a position as a senior vice president at a massive private real estate conglomerate. We are talking a massive signing bonus, executive stock options, the whole package. The Lord is truly elevating our territory. The guests cheered loudly, raising their glasses in a toast to the happy couple. "My husband is going to be running the biggest deals in the city," Ebony bragged, her voice echoing over the speakers. The crowd clapped louder. Someone near the front yelled out, asking, "What is the name of the company, Spencer?" Spencer puffed out his chest, flashing his perfect white teeth for the cameras. "It is a highly exclusive firm," he boasted, adjusting his expensive watch. "Apex Holdings." I was in the middle of picking up the metal tongs to return to the grill. When those two words left his mouth, My fingers went completely numb. The heavy, greasy tongs slipped from my grip and clattered loudly against the stone patio. My heart stopped and then restarted with a violent pounding rhythm. Apex Holdings, the completely anonymous shell company my wealth management lawyer had filed the paperwork for just 48 hours ago, the blind trust that held my $120 million. Spencer, the man who just told me I was born to serve, was bragging to the entire neighborhood about becoming a senior vice president at a company that I owned. I looked up at him grinning on that balcony, and a cold, calculating silence washed over my mind. The game had just changed, and they had no idea who was holding all the cards. He was standing up there acting like he had conquered the world, while I stood in the shadows, knowing I could crush his entire existence with a single phone call. I slowly bent down and picked up the tongs from the stone patio, gripping them tightly in my hands. The smell of the burning barbecue smoke suddenly did not bother me anymore. The heat of the afternoon sun felt like a warm embrace. I turned back to the grill, flipping the ribs with a steady hand. Let them celebrate, I thought to myself, listening to the cheers of the crowd. Let them drink their champagne and wear their stolen pearls and brag about their fake empires. They were dancing on the deck of a sinking ship, and I was the one holding the only life raft. The very next morning, the thick, heavy, suffocating heat of the Sunday barbecue felt like a distant memory as I stood in the center of my brand new sanctuary. My penthouse sat 40 stories above the bustling Atlanta streets, a sprawling, breathtaking masterpiece of floor-to-ceiling glass, imported Italian marble, and rich, dark mahogany accents. It was a place designed for kings and queens, but today, it was my personal war room. I was still wearing a faded, oversized t-shirt and bleach-stained sweatpants, just in case anyone from my toxic family decided to drop by unexpectedly or demand a video call to check up on me. I had already planted the strategic seed that I picked up a side hustle cleaning luxury apartments for wealthy clients in the city. It was the perfect foolproof alibi. It explained why I might be seen walking around affluent elite neighborhoods and gave me total unrestricted access to my own home without raising a single red flag to my mother or sister. I walked over to the massive kitchen island where my encrypted laptop sat open next to a steaming mug of black coffee. My wealth management lawyer, Marcus, had sent over a highly secure file late last night. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee and clicked open the documents. The first folder contained the complete financial portfolio of the property management group that owned Ebony and Spencer's sprawling suburban McMansion. It took exactly 3 phone calls and a wire transfer that amounted to absolute pocket change for me to acquire the management company through one of Apex Holdings' subsidiary branches. As of 9 o'clock this morning, I was officially my sister's landlord. I scrolled through the tenant ledgers and a cold, deeply satisfying smile spread across my face. The reality of their luxurious life was laid bare in black and white accounting text. Ebony and Spencer were exactly 3 months behind on their rent. The previous property management company had already issued 2 grace periods and was actively drafting a notice to vacate the premises. They were living in a massive 6-bedroom house with fake Grecian columns and a leaking pool that they could not even afford to maintain. But that was not all the file contained. Marcus had also pulled the financial records on the gleaming silver Porsche that Ebony drove to church every Sunday like it was a chariot sent directly from heaven to bless her. She acted like she bought it with cold hard cash from her booming real estate business. The truth was, it was a lease, and it was currently in severe, unrecoverable default. She was thousands of miles over her strict contractual limit, and the dealership had already initiated the repossession protocol. The luxury car she used to belittle my existence was literally a few days away from being towed in the middle of the night. I sat back on the plush leather bar stool, shaking my head at the sheer audacity of their relentless delusions. They were drowning in a sea of predatory debt entirely created by their obsession with appearing wealthy to people who did not even care about them. And instead of downsizing or budgeting, they just kept digging the hole deeper, hoping nobody would notice the dirt caving in around them. I moved my cursor to the second heavily encrypted folder labeled Spencer Employment Verification, Apex Holdings. My heart beat with a steady, rhythmic precision as I opened his comprehensive background check. Spencer had marched right up to my face, smelling of expensive bourbon, and told me that some people were just born to serve. He had bragged loudly to his golf buddies about his immense financial literacy and his brilliant corporate maneuvers. But the detailed report staring back at me painted the picture of a desperate, sinking man who was entirely out of options. He had not voluntarily left his previous firm to seek better opportunities, as he so proudly announced to his friends on the patio. The truth was far more pathetic and sinister. Spencer had been unceremoniously fired and escorted out of his previous office building by armed security guards exactly 2 weeks ago. The internal audit from his old firm showed that he had been systematically embezzling corporate funds to cover his disastrous day trading losses. He had secretly siphoned nearly $100,000 in unauthorized transfers, creating fake vendor invoices and dummy corporate accounts to play the stock market with money that did not belong to him. His trades were reckless, driven by pure ego rather than strategy, and the market had swallowed his embezzled funds whole. The only reason he was not currently sitting in a jail cell wearing a county jumpsuit was because he had signed a draconian non-disclosure agreement and quietly forfeited every single penny of his vested retirement accounts to pay the firm back to avoid criminal prosecution. He was completely and utterly broke. He had zero savings, zero liquid assets, and a credit score that was in an absolute freefall. He had applied to Apex Holdings out of pure sheer desperation, throwing his embellished resume at every real estate conglomerate in the city, praying for a miracle to save his fake life before his wife found out the truth. He thought he was brilliant. He thought he had successfully outsmarted the system and secured a senior vice president position that would magically erase his mountain of secret failures. He had absolutely no idea that the billionaire boss he was so eager to impress was the exact same woman he had just handed a dirty pair of barbecue tongs to. I picked up my phone and dialed the private direct line for the Director of Human Resources at Apex Holdings. The phone rang only once before the director answered with practiced efficiency. I kept my voice smooth, calm, and entirely authoritative. I told her I was reviewing the final candidate list for the new Senior Vice President of Acquisitions, and I had made a definitive decision regarding Spencer's application. I instructed her to hire him immediately, but with a very specific and non-negotiable caveat. He was not to receive the standard ironclad executive contract that came with protections and heavy severance packages. Instead, she was to offer him a strict 30-day probationary contract. I wanted him to have the highest possible base salary listed on paper with a massive, unrealistic performance bonus written into the terms. I wanted the offer letter to look so incredibly lucrative that he would be absolutely blinded by his own toxic greed. I wanted him to believe that his prayers had been answered, that his fake empire was entirely secure, and that he had completely gotten away with his crimes. "Hire him," I told my HR director, my tone leaving no room for questions. "Give him the 30-day probationary contract. Let him think he is completely saved. Let him sign the paperwork and think he has won the corporate lottery. Give him a corner office with a view and total access to the corporate credit account for client entertainment. Let him get as comfortable as possible." The director agreed instantly, confirming that the offer letter would be sent to his personal inbox within the hour. I ended the call and closed my laptop, feeling a wave of dark, delicious anticipation wash over me. I was going to give Spencer everything he ever wanted, just so I could be the one to rip the rug right out from under his feet. The serene silence of my penthouse was abruptly shattered by the shrill, jarring ringtone of my cheap prepaid burner phone. I kept it specifically for family communication so they would never see a new upgraded phone number and start asking invasive questions about my finances. I glanced down at the cracked screen and saw my mother's name flashing brightly. It had been less than 24 hours since she stood on that patio and told me I belonged on a city bus, and snatched my grandmother's vintage pearls right out from under me just to place them on Ebony's neck. I took a deep breath, letting the lingering anger settle into a cold, hard block in my stomach before swiping to answer. I did not even get the chance to say hello before Geraldine's voice came barking through the tiny, damaged speaker. Her tone was completely frantic, laced with a sharp, demanding edge that left absolutely no room for discussion or hesitation. I could hear muffled crying in the background, which sounded exactly like Ebony pitching a fit. "Octavia, get to my house right now." Geraldine ordered, her voice carrying the unmistakable echo of her large, empty living room. "Do not tell me you are working, and do not tell me you are busy. You need to drop whatever useless thing you are doing and get over here immediately." I kept my voice soft, playing the familiar role of the subservient, obedient daughter who was easily cowed by her mother's wrath. I asked her what was wrong and if someone was hurt or in the hospital. "No one is hurt," she snapped, her patience clearly hanging by a microscopic thread. "Your sister has an emergency. A serious financial emergency, and we need to handle it today before the banks close for the weekend. Bring your state identification card and your tax returns from the last 2 years. Make sure you have the physical printed copies, Octavia. This is not a game, and I do not have time for your incompetence. Get in your car and get over here." The line went dead with a sharp, aggressive click. I stood in the middle of my imported marble kitchen, holding the cheap plastic phone, listening to the dial tone hum against my ear. She did not ask me for a favor. She demanded my total compliance, and she specifically demanded my state identification and my formal tax documents. The puzzle pieces instantly snapped together in my mind, forming a crystal clear picture of their desperation. Ebony was entirely out of money. The luxury lease was defaulting, the exorbitant rent was due, and Spencer's first probationary paycheck from Apex Holdings was not going to clear the bank for another 30 days. They needed a massive influx of cash immediately to keep up their pathetic charade, and they were coming for the only person they felt they could completely control and manipulate. They wanted to use my pristine, untouched credit score to save their sinking ship. I walked into my massive walk-in closet and bypassed the rows of newly purchased designer clothing, reaching into the very back to pull out my old faded jeans and a scuffed pair of worn-out sneakers. I had to look the part of the struggling line cook. I gathered my old tax documents from a battered cardboard folder, printed out a paper copy of my ID, and headed down to the parking garage to get into my rattling sedan. The drive to Geraldine's house took 40 minutes, but my mind was moving at light speed the entire way, anticipating their trap. I pulled into her pristine driveway, parking carefully behind Ebony's leased Porsche. I walked up the brick pathway and pushed open the heavy mahogany front door without knocking, just like they always expected me to do. The atmosphere inside the house was incredibly tense and heavy with desperation. Geraldine and Ebony were sitting at the formal dining room table, leaning over a stack of thick legal paperwork. Spencer was pacing back and forth by the large bay windows, looking paler than usual. I walked into the room and looked down at the documents spread across the polished table. Sitting right there in plain sight was a predatory high-interest loan application completely filled out with my legal name on it. I gripped the steering wheel of my dented sedan, listening to the sound of Jamal sobbing through the car speakers. My chest tightened with a fierce protective warmth as he kept repeating that his massive $80,000 student loan debt was completely gone. He was hyperventilating, pacing around his tiny, cramped apartment, genuinely terrified that the bank had made a mistake and would call him back to demand the money. I kept my voice soft and steady, telling him to breathe and suggesting that maybe it was an anonymous grant or a clerical error in his favor. I told him not to ask questions and just accept the miracle he so deeply deserved. He hung up the phone, still crying tears of pure relief, unaware that his big sister had just cleared the single heaviest burden from his shoulders with a quick email to her wealth manager. But clearing his debt was only the very first phase of my plan for my brother. I knew Jamal had been staying up late for years, drafting a brilliant, comprehensive business plan for a modern logistics and delivery fleet. He knew the industry inside and out from his grueling years in a delivery uniform, but he had always been completely locked out of the financial capital needed to make it a reality. Until now. I contacted Marcus at Apex Holdings and instructed him to set up a totally legitimate-looking boutique venture capital firm under a different corporate umbrella. We called it Summit Ventures. Within 3 days, Summit Ventures reached out to Jamal claiming they had discovered his profile on a professional networking site and were incredibly interested in his logistics models. They invited him downtown for a formal pitch. Later that evening, Jamal called me practically shaking with nervous energy. He told me he bought a single discounted suit from a thrift store and had it tailored just for the meeting. I stood in the shadows of my penthouse, wiping away a stray tear as I imagined him walking into that massive glass conference room. According to the report I received from the Summit Ventures executives, Jamal absolutely dominated the pitch. He knew every metric, every profit margin, and every supply chain vulnerability. The executives did not even let him finish his presentation before they slid a leather-bound folder across the table. They offered to fully fund his independent logistics company with a $2 million seed investment. The speed at which Jamal's life changed was nothing short of breathtaking. Within exactly 10 days, my brother went from a financially drowning delivery driver to the chief executive officer of his own fully funded corporation. Apex Holdings quietly facilitated the lease of a sleek modern warehouse facility on the edge of the city. Jamal purchased a fleet of 5 pristine heavy-duty delivery trucks, each one gleaming white and professionally decaled with his brand-new company logo. His operating budget included a massive 6-figure executive salary that instantly elevated him out of poverty and into a life of absolute security. He was hiring drivers, setting up dispatch systems, and finally building the empire he had always dreamed of. And he did it all thinking his sheer talent had finally been recognized by the universe. I watched his journey through photos he sent me, feeling an overwhelming sense of pride that easily eclipsed the rage I held for the rest of my family. But in the modern world, joy is rarely kept a secret for long. Jamal could not contain his immense excitement and pride. He posted a professional photograph on his social media accounts, standing confidently in his tailored suit right in front of his line of pristine branded delivery trucks. The caption simply thanked God for new beginnings and the opportunity to build a legacy. The news traveled through our toxic family network faster than a wildfire. Within hours of the post going live, Geraldine and Ebony had seen the photos. Their reaction was instantaneous and entirely predictable. My burner phone buzzed with a group text message from Geraldine demanding a mandatory family meeting at a local upscale diner in Midtown. She framed it as a celebratory lunch for Jamal, but I knew exactly what it really was. The sharks had smelled blood in the water and they were circling. When I walked into the diner the following afternoon, the atmosphere at the large corner booth was already suffocatingly thick. I was still wearing my faded work clothes, intentionally maintaining my cover. Geraldine, Ebony, and Spencer completely ignored my arrival. They did not even look up when I slid into the empty seat at the far end of the booth. Their entire intense focus was locked solely onto Jamal, who sat across from them, looking incredibly uncomfortable in his new designer jacket. They were absolutely fawning over him, acting as if they had always believed in his potential. Spencer was leaning across the table, swirling a glass of iced tea and attempting to play the role of the seasoned corporate mentor. He kept using flashy buzzwords, trying to sound like a titan of industry while completely masking his own desperate financial ruin. He patted Jamal on the shoulder, telling him that managing real wealth required a steady hand, and that he was willing to look over the corporate structure to make sure Jamal was not making any rookie mistakes. The sheer aggressive greed radiating from Spencer was almost comical, considering I knew he had just been fired for embezzlement and was secretly working a probationary contract at my own company. Then Geraldine decided it was time to bring down the hammer. She reached across the table and placed her hands over Jamal's, looking at him with a deeply manipulative maternal gaze. She told him that the Lord had clearly blessed him with this sudden, immense wealth for a very specific divine purpose. She explained that her church, the First Baptist Church of Atlanta, was currently running a massive sanctuary expansion campaign and that she was personally responsible for securing large donations. Her voice dropped into a commanding, demanding register as she told Jamal that he needed to tithe $500,000 directly to her department. She insisted that giving $500,000 to the church would solidify his spiritual foundation and, more importantly, elevate her own personal status among the church elders. She looked at him not as a son, but as a walking open checkbook. Before Jamal could even process the absurdity of her demand, Ebony chimed in with her own performance. She forced fake tears to well up in her eyes, dabbing at her face with a napkin. She told Jamal how incredibly stressed she was playing the role of the victim perfectly. She claimed that the real estate market was taking a toll on her mental health, and that she desperately needed her little brother to step up and rescue her. Ebony explicitly demanded that Jamal use his new venture capital money to pay off all of her maxed-out credit cards and completely cover the remaining balance on her Porsche lease. She argued that since he was now a millionaire, it was his fundamental duty to elevate the entire family's lifestyle so they could all look the part of a successful dynasty. They sat there staring at him, fully expecting him to bow his head and hand over the keys to his newly built life. I watched Jamal closely, my heart pounding in my chest. The night before this lunch, I had called him and gently warned him about exactly what would happen. I told him that wealth changes the people around you, and that he needed to protect his blessing at all costs. I could see his jaw clenching as he looked from our greedy mother to our incredibly selfish sister. The nervous energy he used to carry was completely gone. He slowly pulled his hands away from Geraldine and sat back in the leather booth. His voice was remarkably calm, but laced with a cold, hard steel I had never heard from him before. Jamal looked Geraldine dead in the eye and issued a flat, undeniable refusal. He told them he was not giving a single dime to the church, and he was absolutely not paying off Ebony's luxury car. Geraldine gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck, while Ebony's fake tears instantly vanished, replaced by pure venom. Jamal did not back down. He leaned forward and asked them where their family loyalty was when he was sleeping in the back seat of his beat-up Honda Civic between double shifts just to make rent. He asked where their divine blessings were when he was eating leftover food from the restaurant and drowning in debt. He pointed a firm finger directly at me, sitting quietly at the end of the table. He told them that the only person in this entire family who ever actually cared if he lived or died was Octavia. He stated loudly that I was the only one who truly had his back when he had absolutely nothing, and he would never let them use him to fund their fake empty lives. The illusion of the happy family gathering completely shattered. Spencer immediately dropped the friendly mentor act, his face twisting into an ugly, arrogant sneer. He slammed his hand down on the diner table, causing the silverware to rattle loudly. He looked at Jamal with absolute disgust and called him a glorified delivery boy who just got lucky with a pity investment from some blind venture capitalists. Spencer raised his voice, demanding that Jamal stop acting like he was an actual executive. He ordered Jamal to show his mother the respect she was owed and to hand over the cash she deserved before he lost everything just as fast as he got it. Spencer's arrogance was astounding, considering the very salary he was currently surviving on was being paid directly by my private accounts. The argument rapidly escalated into a chaotic shouting match. Geraldine's voice grew shrill and unhinged as she began yelling about ungrateful children and the wrath of God. She pointed at Jamal, calling him selfish and demonic for withholding money from his own mother and her ministry. People at the surrounding tables were beginning to stare, but Geraldine did not care. She was completely consumed by the rage of losing her grip on a potential fortune. Ebony was shrieking about how embarrassed she was to be related to someone so cheap. Right in the middle of Geraldine's furious tirade, a sharp, loud emergency alert tone erupted from her designer handbag. The sudden blaring noise momentarily silenced the entire table. Geraldine huffed in annoyance, reaching into her bag to retrieve her phone. She swiped at the screen, intending to dismiss the notification and continue her verbal assault. But the very second her eyes focused on the text illuminating the glass display, her entire demeanor changed. The aggressive, fiery rage instantly drained out of her face, leaving her looking gray hollow and completely terrified. Her hand began to tremble so violently that the phone nearly slipped from her grasp. The alert was not a simple text message. It was an urgent breaking news notification from a major local financial outlet. The public notice blared across her screen, stating that the First Baptist Church of Atlanta, the massive, untouchable megachurch where Geraldine proudly served as the head of finance, had just been served with a public foreclosure notice due to millions of dollars in mysteriously missing unrecoverable funds. The empire she had been hiding behind was completely falling apart. The color completely drained from Geraldine's face as the breaking news alert flashed across her screen. The heavy diner mug slipped from her trembling fingers and shattered against the floor, spilling lukewarm coffee over her expensive designer shoes. She did not even notice the mess. She just stared at the glowing rectangle of glass as her entire carefully curated existence began to collapse in real time. Jamal looked at her with a mixture of confusion and absolute disgust before turning on his heel and walking out of the diner, leaving them to drown in their own sudden panic. Ebony and Spencer scrambled out of the booth, grabbing Geraldine by the arms and dragging her toward the back exit of the restaurant, away from the prying eyes of the other patrons. Once they reached the humid privacy of the alleyway behind the diner, the horrifying truth finally spilled out of my mother's mouth in ragged, breathless sobs. She confessed everything to her golden child and her supposedly brilliant son-in-law. She admitted that the church sanctuary expansion fund was a complete fabrication designed to mask a catastrophic financial deficit. Months ago, Spencer had approached her with a guaranteed insider stock tip, begging for capital to execute the trade. When the bank refused to extend him any more credit, Geraldine made the fateful decision to borrow from the Lord. She quietly wired hundreds of thousands of dollars from the church operating accounts directly into Spencer's failing brokerage accounts. She fully believed his arrogant promises that the stock would triple in value, allowing her to replace the church funds within a week before anyone ever noticed. She had convinced herself that God would bless the transaction and reward her faith in Spencer's financial genius. But the stock plummeted, and the holy money was vaporized instantly. To cover up the missing funds, Geraldine had been cooking the books and skipping mortgage payments on the massive church building itself. She had gambled the literal house of God to fund Spencer's toxic ego and Ebony's insatiable need for luxury. Now the commercial lender had lost patience and filed a public notice of foreclosure. Geraldine gripped Ebony's silk shirt, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the fragile fabric. She explained between violent gasps for air that the board of elders and the senior pastor would see the news within the hour. When they ordered an emergency audit, the embezzlement would be completely undeniable. They would not handle this quietly as a family matter to protect her pride. They would involve federal authorities immediately to save the church's reputation. She was staring down the barrel of a multi-million-dollar wire fraud charge and decades in a federal penitentiary. The woman who sat in the front pew every Sunday, judging the congregation for their lack of faith, was about to be exposed as a common thief. Her reputation, her freedom, and her entire identity as a righteous matriarch were seconds away from complete annihilation. While Geraldine was having a total nervous breakdown in a dirty alleyway, Spencer was busy living in an absolute fantasy world. The very next morning, he strutted into the towering glass and steel lobby of Apex Holdings for his first official day of work. He was wearing a brand new tailored suit he absolutely could not afford, having purchased it with the very last sliver of available credit on a high-interest store card. He walked through the sliding glass security doors, acting like he owned the entire skyscraper. He immediately began treating the support staff like garbage. When the receptionist politely asked him to fill out his entry forms, he rolled his eyes and tossed his pen across her desk, telling her to fill them out for him because his time was much too valuable for paperwork. He snapped his fingers at a passing junior analyst, demanding a specific type of imported coffee and threatening to have the young man fired if the drink was too cold. Spencer was riding a massive wave of unearned arrogance, completely blind to the fact that his every move was being monitored by a silent, unseen boss. He was escorted to a sprawling corner office on the 35th floor, an office with panoramic views of the entire Atlanta skyline. He threw his leather briefcase onto the mahogany desk, kicked his expensive shoes up onto the polished wood, and immediately pulled out his phone to call Ebony. His voice boomed through the empty office as he bragged to his wife about his spectacular new domain. He told her loudly that the mysterious billionaire owner of Apex Holdings had personally selected him for the job and clearly saw his immense genius. He assured Ebony that the 30-day probationary period was nothing but a standard corporate formality and that his new boss was already in love with his business acumen. Spencer spun a web of total delusion, promising his panicking wife that he would simply demand a massive multi-million-dollar advance on his executive bonus by the end of the week. He claimed this phantom money would easily be enough to quietly pay off the missing church funds, stop the foreclosure, and keep Geraldine out of federal prison while saving their leased McMansion from eviction. He sat in the lavish office, soaking in the spectacular view, and genuinely believed he had outsmarted the entire world. He thought his lies and his theft were securely buried under his new impressive title. He had absolutely no idea that the chair he was sitting in, the desk he was kicking, and the very air conditioning he was breathing were all paid for by the sister-in-law he had spent years treating like an uneducated peasant. I watched his entire pathetic performance from the absolute safety of my ultra-luxury penthouse on the other side of the city. I sat deep in a plush leather armchair, staring at a bank of high-definition monitors that fed directly from the discreet security cameras installed in Spencer's new office. The audio feed was crystal clear, picking up every arrogant lie he fed to my sister over the phone. I took a slow sip of my dark coffee, watching him adjust his stolen tie and practice his ridiculous power poses in the reflection of the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. He was a blind mouse trapped in a maze, completely unaware of the scientist watching from above. A soft chime from my encrypted laptop drew my attention away from the live camera feed. My wealth manager, Marcus, had sent over the final digital acquisition documents for my urgent review. The legal paperwork was dense and incredibly complex, but the bottom line was beautifully simple. Apex Holdings was officially purchasing the commercial debt of the First Baptist Church of Atlanta. The bank was absolutely thrilled to offload the toxic multi-million-dollar liability quietly and instantly without a public media circus. I scrolled to the bottom of the digital contract and typed my secure electronic signature. The massive transaction processed in a matter of seconds. $2 million flowed effortlessly out of my blind trust and directly into the commercial lender's accounts. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, feeling the immense crushing weight of the absolute power I had just acquired. I did not just buy an old stone building, I bought the very ground my mother proudly stood on. I now held the literal physical deed to the massive sanctuary where Geraldine had spent decades building her fake, untouchable empire of morality. I owned the sacred altar where she prayed and the finance office where she stole from the collection plates. I owned the very debt that could send her to federal prison for the rest of her natural life. With a single email from my anonymous proxy, I could have the local sheriff arrive at Sunday service and lock the heavy wooden doors forever, or I could hand over the unredacted financial records to the district attorney and watch my mother be carried out of her pristine suburban house in cold steel handcuffs. Her precious reputation, her fading freedom, and her entire crumbling future were resting quietly in the palm of my flour-covered hands. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark purple shadows across the city. As I left the gleaming penthouse and drove my beat-up dented sedan back to the tiny, cramped apartment I still maintained for physical appearances, I stayed in my greasy chef uniform, needing them to fully believe I was still the same struggling line cook who could barely afford to buy weekly groceries. The very moment I unlocked my flimsy wooden door, a loud, aggressive pounding rattled the entire frame. The knocks were heavy, panicked, and deeply desperate. I pulled the door open to find Ebony standing in the dim hallway looking completely manic and unhinged. Her expensive designer makeup was smeared darkly under her eyes, and her chest was heaving with erratic, shallow breaths. But she was not alone. Spencer stepped out from the dark shadows of the stairwell, his fake corporate confidence entirely replaced by a sweating, wide-eyed sheer panic. Geraldine appeared right behind him, looking exactly like a hunted, injured animal. They did not wait for an invitation or offer a greeting. They shoved forcefully past me and pushed their way into my tiny living room, bringing the suffocating, rancid stench of their total desperation with them. They looked around the cramped, dim space with wild, frantic, searching eyes. They were finally backed into a dangerous corner, with no way out, and they were about to cross a terrifying line they could never uncross. The heavy wooden door of my tiny decoy apartment slammed shut behind them, trapping me in the cramped, dimly lit living room with the three people who despised me most in the world. The air instantly grew thick and suffocating. The cheap smell of bleach and instant ramen that deliberately coated my apartment clashed violently with Geraldine's heavy designer perfume and Spencer's expensive bourbon sweat. I stood perfectly still, my hands tucked deep into the pockets of my stained work apron as they descended upon me like starving wolves. Geraldine was hyperventilating, pacing the worn linoleum floor with her hands clutching her head. She looked completely unhinged, her perfectly styled hair now a disheveled mess. She practically shrieked at me that the church foreclosure was going to be the lead story on the evening news, and that the entire congregation was going to see the notice of default before Sunday service. Her voice cracked as she told me that the Board of Elders was already calling her phone demanding an emergency meeting, and that if she did not produce the missing funds immediately, she was going to be walking into a federal prison. She did not show an ounce of remorse for stealing the money. Her only regret was that she had been caught, and her only focus was finding a scapegoat to bleed dry. Ebony aggressively stepped into my personal space, her face twisted into a mask of pure, selfish entitlement. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest and demanded that I fix this right now. She screamed that Jamal had $2 million sitting in a liquid bank account while she was about to lose her luxury Porsche and her sprawling house. She completely ignored the fact that her husband had embezzled his way into their financial ruin. In her mind, the universe owed her a life of luxury, and Jamal was selfishly hoarding her rightful salvation. She demanded that I pick up my phone and call our brother immediately. "You need to convince him to hand over the money, Octavia," she ordered, her voice shrill and commanding. "You are the only one he actually cares about. You speak loser, he will listen to you." She stood there with her hands on her hips, genuinely believing that her cruel, insulting demand was a perfectly reasonable strategy. They expected me to manipulate the brother I had just secretly elevated out of poverty, to hand his entire future over to the very people who had mocked him for sleeping in his car. They wanted me to break his spirit so they could preserve their fake plastic empires. I looked at the three of them, letting the silence stretch out until the tension in the room was almost unbearable. My face remained a blank, unreadable slate. I told them in a quiet, steady voice that I was not going to call Jamal. I told them that he had earned that venture capital investment through his own hard work and sheer brilliance, and that I would never ask him to throw his life away to cover up their criminal mistakes. I told Geraldine she should have thought about the federal authorities before she transferred holy money into a day trading account. I told Ebony she should have married a man who actually knew how to earn a legitimate paycheck instead of leasing cars she could not afford. The moment the words left my mouth, Spencer absolutely lost his mind. The fake polished corporate facade he had been wearing all afternoon completely evaporated, revealing the insecure, toxic bully hiding underneath. He lunged forward, closing the distance between us until he backed me directly into the cheap Formica kitchen counter. He towered over me, his face flushed red with unhinged rage, his breath smelling of stale coffee and desperation. He pointed a heavy finger right in my face and unleashed a torrent of the most vile, classist microaggressions I had ever heard. "Listen to me, you pathetic line cook," he snarled, his voice vibrating with absolute contempt. "You think you can stand there in your greasy clothes and judge us? This family is drowning because people like you drag us down with your poverty and your lack of ambition." He leaned in closer, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me into submission. "You have no husband, no money, and no future. You are nothing but a stain on our reputation." I slowly and deliberately slipped my right hand into the deep pocket of my work apron, my fingers silently finding the side button of my burner phone. With a quick, practiced motion, I activated the voice recorder, capturing every single word of his toxic meltdown. Spencer was so completely blinded by his own towering ego that he just kept digging his grave deeper and deeper. He proudly announced that he was a senior vice president at Apex Holdings now. He bragged that his new billionaire boss loved him and that he was going to receive a signing bonus so massive it would make my entire lifetime of wages look like spare change. He told me that he was the only real provider in this family and that I was just a jealous, bitter spinster who wanted to see them fail. He slammed his hand against the counter next to my hip, shaking the cheap wooden cabinets. "Do what your mother says right now, Octavia." He threatened, his eyes wide and manic. "Do it before I make sure you cannot even get a job flipping burgers in this town. I know people. I have powerful connections. I can ruin your pathetic little life with one single phone call." He stood there panting, waiting for me to break down. Geraldine and Ebony stood behind him, crossing their arms, entirely supportive of his aggressive, disgusting tirade. They fully expected me to burst into tears, to cower in fear, and to immediately beg for their forgiveness before calling Jamal to surrender the $2 million. They had spent my entire life breaking my spirit, and they thought this time would be no different. But I did not cry. I did not flinch. I did not even blink. I let the silence fill the tiny apartment as the recorder in my pocket captured the heavy breathing of the man whose entire professional future rested squarely in the palm of my hand. I looked at Spencer, taking in his cheap desperation. I looked at Ebony, observing her hollow panic. I looked at Geraldine, seeing nothing but a terrified thief. My eyes were completely dead cold and devoid of any familial warmth. The shift in my energy was so sudden and so absolute that Spencer actually took a hesitant step back, his bully instincts faltering against my absolute stillness. I straightened my posture, letting the invisible weight of my actual authority fill the cramped room. "You are right," I said, my voice perfectly flat and ringing with a hollow, chilling finality. "I am just a pathetic line cook. I have no money and I have no power. There is absolutely nothing I can do to help you. You will have to fix your own mess." I walked past Spencer, brushing my shoulder against his tailored suit, and stepped over to the front door. I grabbed the cheap brass knob and pulled the door wide open, letting the drafty hallway air rush into the apartment. I looked directly at my mother, my expression entirely, completely blank. "Have a great time at the church gala this Saturday," I said, my voice echoing softly in the quiet hall. They were completely stunned by my cold dismissal. Geraldine opened her mouth to scream another demand, but the freezing, terrifying authority radiating from my posture physically stopped her. Ebony looked genuinely unsettled, and Spencer just stood there, grinding his jaw in confused anger. Having absolutely no leverage left, and running out of time before the bank finalized the foreclosure, they had no choice but to leave. They filed out of the apartment, grumbling toxic curses and threatening that I would pay for my disrespect. I watched them walk down the dingy carpeted hallway until they disappeared into the stairwell. I slowly closed the door and turned the deadbolt, locking them out of my life. I pulled my phone from my apron pocket and hit save on the audio recording of Spencer S. unhinged threats, securing the exact evidence I needed to destroy his fake corporate career. I walked over to the small plastic dining table and unzipped my battered canvas work bag. I reached into a hidden zippered compartment at the very bottom and pulled out a heavy, thick envelope made of premium ivory cardstock. I ran my fingers over the elegant gold-embossed lettering on the front. It was the formal exclusive invitation to the First Baptist Church of Atlanta annual fundraising gala taking place this weekend. It was the very same event where Geraldine was planning to desperately beg the wealthy congregation to save the sanctuary from the foreclosure she had secretly caused. I flipped the envelope over and stared down at the calligraphy. It was not addressed to Octavia the line cook. It was addressed directly to the anonymous owner and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. I smiled in the dark, empty apartment, knowing the absolute destruction I was about to bring to their perfectly curated nightmare. I slipped the thick, gold-embossed invitation back into my battered canvas work bag and walked out of that dingy decoy apartment for the absolute last time. My old life of shrinking into the background and accepting their endless abuse was officially dead, and it was time to dress for the funeral. The next morning, the warm Atlanta sun poured through the massive windows of my penthouse as I drank my black coffee and meticulously planned the final stages of their destruction. I did not just want to show up at the gala and shock them. I wanted to completely obliterate their entire social hierarchy and strip away every fake layer of superiority they hid behind. I needed absolute flawless armor. I called my personal assistant and instructed her to book out an entire high-end luxury boutique in the wealthiest district of Buckhead for a private, completely undisturbed fitting. When I arrived, the heavy glass doors were locked to the public, and a team of eager stylists was waiting for me with silver trays of expensive champagne. I bypassed the soft pastels, the modest cuts, and the safe conservative styles entirely. I was not dressing for male validation, and I was certainly not dressing to look like the submissive, obedient daughter my mother always demanded I be. I was dressing for total absolute war. I selected a breathtaking $15,000 custom designer gown made of heavy, midnight blue silk that clung to my frame like liquid metal. It featured a sharp, plunging neckline and a dramatic sweeping train that demanded total authority the moment it touched the floor. I paired it with a pair of imported Italian stilettos that felt like sharpened daggers, ready to step on the necks of anyone who challenged me. But the clothes were only the foundation of the transformation. Marcus had a private jeweler bring a locked velvet case directly to the boutique under armed guard. I bypassed the delicate strings of pearls and the subtle diamond chains, selecting a spectacular diamond collar that rested cold and heavy against my collarbone. It sparkled with a blinding, predatory light, catching the reflection of the chandeliers above. It was a piece of jewelry that cost more than Geraldine's entire suburban house, and it looked exactly like what it was: absolute, unchecked power. For the finishing touch, I hired a premier celebrity glam squad to meet me back at the penthouse. They spent 4 intensive hours completely transforming my face and hair. My hair was slicked back into a severe, flawless style that highlighted the sharp, unyielding angles of my cheekbones. My makeup was completely ruthless, with dark, smoky eyes and a deep crimson lip that made me look like an entirely different person. I stood up and stared at myself in the floor-to-ceiling mirror of my master bedroom. The desperate line cook, the invisible sister, the pathetic family scapegoat was gone forever. Staring back at me was the anonymous billionaire, the apex predator who was about to devour her own toxic family. With my armor fully assembled, I sat down at my massive glass desk and opened my encrypted laptop to set the traps. Timing was the most critical element of this entire operation. The church gala was scheduled to begin at 7 o'clock on Saturday evening, with the main donor presentation taking place right at 8. I wanted Ebony and Spencer to be standing in the middle of a crowded ballroom surrounded by the wealthiest religious elites in the city when their entire fake reality came crashing down around them. I opened a secure email thread to the legal department of the property management company I had just recently acquired. I typed out a very specific and completely non-negotiable set of instructions regarding the lease on my sister S. suburban McMansion. The management team was to finalize the formal legal notice to vacate the premises due to severe non-payment and breach of contract. But they were not to serve the papers during normal business hours or quietly slip them into the mailbox. I instructed them to have a certified process server physically tape the bright orange 3-day eviction notice directly to the front door of their house at exactly 8 o'clock on Saturday night. Simultaneously, the automated legal system was to send an urgent electronic copy of the eviction mandate directly to Ebony S. phone and Spencer S. phone. I wanted their devices to buzz with the devastating news of their sudden homelessness right as they were holding crystal champagne glasses and pretending to be part of the wealthy upper crust. I hit send and watched the delivery confirmation flash across the screen. Then I opened a second secure email window, this one directed to the head of human resources at Apex Holdings. Spencer had spent the last 2 days terrorizing the support staff and acting like he owned the entire skyscraper, all while floating on a fragile 30-day probationary contract that I had personally orchestrated. He had been using the company credit card to buy lavish, expensive lunches to impress his broke friends. I typed out the formal termination of his employment effective immediately for violating corporate conduct and severe insubordination. My instructions to the HR director were ruthless and incredibly precise. The formal termination email was to be sent to his inbox at exactly 8:05 on Saturday evening, just 5 minutes after the eviction notice hit his phone. At the exact same moment, the Apex Holdings IT department was to remotely wipe his company phone, deactivate his access to the corporate server, and immediately cancel the company credit card he had been carrying around like a golden ticket. By 8:06, Spencer would be completely locked out of the company network, entirely unemployed, totally broke, and facing imminent, humiliating eviction. I leaned back in my leather chair, listening to the quiet hum of the city far below my penthouse. The guillotine was raised high in the air, and the heavy steel blades were razor sharp. All they had to do now was walk directly onto the chopping block. The final phase of the master plan required manipulating the massive bloated ego of the First Baptist Church of Atlanta. Earlier that week, the bank had officially transferred the $2 million commercial debt of the church directly to the Apex Holdings financial portfolio. The Church Finance Committee, which was led by my terrified and desperate mother, was in an absolute state of sheer panic. Marcus had kept me updated on the frantic crying phone calls flooding into the Apex corporate offices all week. The senior pastor had been leaving desperate pleading voicemails begging for an emergency meeting with the anonymous new debt holder to discuss restructuring the loans before the foreclosure went public and ruin their prestigious ministry forever. I decided to give them exactly what they were begging for, but entirely on my own destructive terms. I instructed Marcus to send a formal, highly confidential email directly to the senior pastor and the board of elders. The email stated clearly that the anonymous owner and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings would be personally attending their fundraising gala on Saturday night. The email explicitly warned that the CEO would use the gala as an opportunity to strictly evaluate the church's leadership and decide their ultimate financial fate. If the CEO was impressed, Apex Holdings might consider forgiving the massive $2 million debt entirely as a charitable donation. But if the CEO was displeased with the integrity of the church leadership, Apex Holdings would proceed with the immediate foreclosure, seize the holy property, and bulldoze the massive sanctuary to build a highly profitable commercial shopping center. The stakes were absolute life and death for the congregation, and the impending threat sent a massive shockwave through the church administration. According to the church mole that Marcus had spoken to the senior pastor, had nearly suffered a heart attack reading the demanding email. He immediately called an emergency closed-door meeting with the entire finance committee. Geraldine apparently completely cracked under the intense pressure, knowing she was the one who had secretly embezzled the money to pay for Spencer's bad stock tips. But true to her deeply narcissistic nature, she quickly found a twisted way to spin the terrifying situation to her advantage. She proudly announced to the panicking pastor and the weeping board of elders that they had absolutely nothing to worry about. She bragged loudly and arrogantly that her brilliant son-in-law Spencer was a newly appointed senior vice president at Apex Holdings and that he was incredibly close personal friends with the anonymous billionaire CEO. Geraldine completely fabricated a story, promising the church leadership that Spencer had the entire situation completely under control, and that he would personally ensure the debt was entirely forgiven by the end of the night. She staked her entire reputation, her freedom from federal embezzlement charges, and her standing in the religious community on Spencer's fake corporate influence. The pastor was so relieved, he reportedly wept openly and declared that God had sent Spencer to be the ultimate savior of their congregation. They decided to roll out the literal red carpet and treat the incoming Apex Holdings CEO like absolute, untouchable royalty. They were expecting a wealthy old man who could be easily charmed by Spencer's corporate jargon and Geraldine's fake religious devotion. They were completely blind to the massive, inescapable trap slowly closing around them. Saturday night finally arrived, bringing a cool, crisp breeze to the wealthy elite streets of downtown Atlanta. The grand ballroom of the Atlanta Plaza Hotel was completely transformed into a blinding, spectacular display of extreme wealth and religious extravagance. Huge crystal chandeliers glowed above hundreds of round tables draped in heavy white silk and towering, expensive floral arrangements. The local media was gathered tightly behind thick velvet ropes, snapping rapid photos of the city's elite donors as they arrived in their luxury vehicles. At the very front of the massive glass grand entrance, standing directly on the plush red carpet, was the church's official welcoming committee. The senior pastor stood nervously straightening his tuxedo tie and sweating under the bright lights. Right beside him, Geraldine was practically vibrating with desperate, greedy anticipation, her fake smile plastered perfectly across her face. Ebony stood next to her mother, wearing a desperately tight rented gown, dripping in fake costume jewelry, while Spencer stood tall, puffing out his chest and practicing his firm corporate handshake. They were all staring down the long, curving hotel driveway, waiting breathlessly to greet the anonymous billionaire who held their entire existence in the palm of their hands. A sudden deep hush fell over the noisy crowd, and the flashing of camera bulbs intensified rapidly as a sleek, intimidating convoy of 3 pitch-black Maybachs slowly pulled up to the curb. The heavy tires of the lead Maybach glided silently to a halt directly at the base of the grand velvet staircase. The aggressive flashing of the paparazzi cameras merged into a solid, blinding wall of white light, as everyone leaned forward, desperate to catch the first glimpse of the mysterious billionaire who held the entire financial fate of the prestigious congregation in their hands. 4 massive men wearing sharp, dark suits and discreet earpieces stepped out of the trailing vehicles, moving with a terrifying synchronized efficiency to secure a tight perimeter around the main car. The murmurs of the wealthy crowd swelled into a loud, buzzing crescendo. Then the driver, wearing crisp white gloves, slowly walked around the long vehicle and pulled open the heavy rear door of the flagship Maybach. For an agonizingly long second, there was nothing to see but the dark-tinted interior of the cabin. Then a single foot extended into the warm evening air. A glittering imported Italian stiletto covered in crushed crystals touched down onto the plush red carpet. A collective gasp rippled through the gathered elite as I finally emerged from the luxurious depths of the vehicle. The flashbulbs caught the blinding predatory sparkle of the massive diamond collar resting cold and heavy against my throat, casting fractured rainbows of light across the faces of the stunned onlookers. My $15,000 midnight blue silk gown flowed around my body like dark water. The dramatic sweeping train gliding effortlessly over the carpet as I stood up to my full height. I stood perfectly straight, my shoulders pulled back, my face sculpted into a flawless mask of absolute unyielding authority. The celebrity glam squad had spent hours erasing the exhausted, struggling line cook who smelled of bleach and cheap ramen. My hair was slicked back into a severe, flawless style that highlighted the sharp, unyielding angles of my cheekbones, and my makeup was completely ruthless, with dark, smoky eyes and a deep crimson lip. I did not look like the submissive, obedient daughter my mother demanded I be. I looked like a reigning queen stepping onto a conquered battlefield, ready to watch my enemies bleed. Geraldine was standing less than 20 feet away at the top of the stairs, her hands clasped together in fake pious anticipation, ready to grovel before her new savior. The moment her eyes locked onto my face, the heavy layers of her carefully applied makeup seemed to physically crack. Her perfectly practiced welcoming smile completely melted off her face, revealing the raw, terrified confusion hiding underneath. Her jaw literally dropped open, her mouth hanging slack as she stared at the daughter she had spent decades treating like an invisible, uneducated peasant. Beside her, Ebony looked as if she had just been violently struck by a speeding train. Her eyes bulged out of her head, stretching so wide the whites were visible all the way around her dark irises. She was staring directly at the blinding diamond collar around my neck, her brain violently short-circuiting as she tried to calculate how the sister she had mocked just yesterday in that tiny, dingy apartment was now dripping in millions of dollars of authentic jewels. Her manicured hands unconsciously grabbed the cheap, fragile fabric of her rented gown as the suffocating reality of her own collapsing finances clashed violently with my undeniable opulence. Spencer, however, did not possess the basic intelligence or the situational awareness to be terrified. His massive, bloated ego absolutely refused to process the reality standing right in front of him. He was completely trapped in his own toxic corporate delusion, genuinely believing that his phantom billionaire boss was still sitting inside that car, and that I was somehow pulling a pathetic, desperate stunt to embarrass him in front of the Atlanta elite. His face instantly flushed a dark mottled red, the thick veins in his neck bulging against his tight, suffocating collar. He abandoned his place in the official welcoming line and aggressively marched right down the center of the red carpet, storming directly toward me like an enraged, territorial bull. His heavy, clumsy footsteps stomped on the delicate velvet as he completely ignored the confused stares of the wealthy donors and the frantic flashing of the press cameras. "What the hell are you doing here?" He snarled, his voice a venomous, toxic hiss that carried clearly over the quiet murmurs of the stunned crowd. He stopped just inches from my face, trying to use his towering physical size to intimidate me into submission, just like he had done in my kitchen yesterday. "Did you honestly think you could just show up here and ruin my night, you pathetic loser?" He looked me up and down, his eyes filled with absolute dripping contempt as he sneered at my custom designer gown. "Did you max out another high-interest credit card to rent that dress? Whose jewelry did you steal to play dress-up tonight? You look like an absolute clown, Octavia." He stepped even closer, his hot breath reeking of the expensive bourbon he had been drinking all afternoon to calm his mounting financial panic. He pointed a thick, aggressive finger right between my eyes, his face twisted in a mask of pure, unhinged malice. "My boss is in that car right now, and when he steps out, he is going to see the psychotic garbage that I have to deal with in my personal life. This is exactly why this family is drowning, because of trash like you." He spun around and began frantically waving his arms at the bewildered hotel security guards standing near the heavy glass entrance doors. "Security," he screamed, his voice cracking with desperate, unearned authority. "Get this trash out of here immediately before the CEO of Apex Holdings arrives. She is a trespassing lunatic, and she is not on the private guest list. Remove her right now." The hotel security guards hesitated, looking completely confused by the presence of my massive private bodyguards. Spencer completely lost whatever tiny sliver of rational control he had left in his failing brain. He turned back to me, his eyes wide and manic, and aggressively reached out, grabbing my bare arm with his heavy, sweating hand. He intended to physically drag me off the red carpet himself, violently pulling me toward the shadowy edge of the hotel driveway to hide me away like a shameful, dirty secret before his imaginary savior could see me. Before Spencer could even attempt to pull my weight, a blur of dark fabric moved into his peripheral vision. Marcus. My lead corporate attorney stepped smoothly and swiftly out from behind my right shoulder. With a single sharp, forceful motion, Marcus struck Spencer's wrist, violently slapping his heavy hand completely away from my arm. The loud, sharp crack of skin on skin echoed like a gunshot across the quiet red carpet, instantly freezing every single person in their tracks. "Remove your hands from the CEO of Apex Holdings," Marcus said, his voice booming with a cold, terrifying legal authority that sent an immediate shiver down the spine of everyone listening. The words hung suspended in the humid Atlanta air. Spencer completely froze, his arm still suspended awkwardly in the space between us. His arrogant corporate sneer slowly dissolved into a blank, empty mask of total incomprehension. His brain simply refused to process the sentence that had just been spoken. He looked at Marcus and then slowly turned his heavy head to look back at me, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish. I let a slow, dead smile spread across my face, revealing absolutely no mercy and no familial warmth. I calmly reached into the sleek custom designer clutch resting in my left hand and pulled out a crisp single sheet of heavy premium corporate letterhead. I stepped forward, closing the distance until I was looking directly up into his terrified, sweating face. "Spencer, you are not a senior vice president?" I said, my voice perfectly steady and dripping with quiet, devastating power. "You are not an executive. You have no massive signing bonus, and you have absolutely no power. You are a desperate, pathetic fraud, working on a fragile 30-day probationary contract because you lied on your employment background check about your pending federal embezzlement charges." I held the crisp piece of paper up, pressing it flat against his heaving chest. He stared down at it, his eyes tracing the Apex Holdings corporate logo and his own name printed in bold black ink right above the word "terminated." "And as of this exact second, you are officially fired." I whispered the words, slicing through his toxic ego like a razor blade. I took a deliberate step back and looked at the massive security team standing quietly behind me, waiting for my command. "Security," I called out, echoing his earlier pathetic demand, but this time speaking with actual, absolute authority. "Escort my ex-employee off the red carpet immediately. He is trespassing on my property." The massive private bodyguards moved with terrifying professional speed, grabbing Spencer by both arms and forcefully lifting him practically off his expensive stolen shoes. His fragile, toxic reality completely shattered all at once. He began hyperventilating, his chest heaving violently as he shrieked and thrashed against the iron grip of the security team. They dragged him backward down the red carpet, his expensive shoes scraping harshly against the pavement as he sobbed and screamed his empty, meaningless threats into the dark Atlanta night. The wealthy crowd watched in absolute horrified silence as the so-called corporate savior of their church was thrown out into the street like common garbage. Standing at the very top of the stairs, Geraldine watched the brutal public execution of her golden goose and completely panicked. Her entire massive web of lies, the fake sanctuary expansion fund, the stolen holy money, the impending multi-million-dollar wire fraud charges, was about to be exposed to the entire congregation. Her deep, selfish survival instincts kicked into high gear, completely overriding any maternal instinct to protect her screaming daughter or her humiliated son-in-law. She abandoned Ebony on the steps, hiking up the heavy silk skirt of her dress and running frantically inside toward the grand ballroom. She was heading straight for the microphone on the main stage, desperately trying to spin a new web of lies to save her crumbling self-righteous reputation completely and utterly unaware of the massive catastrophic bomb. I was already walking inside to drop right on top of her head. I walked through the heavy glass doors of the grand ballroom, leaving the chaos of the red carpet behind me. The massive room was packed with hundreds of the wealthiest and most influential religious leaders in Atlanta, all sitting at their lavish tables sipping sparkling water and waiting for their anonymous savior. Up on the main stage, Geraldine was already gripping the microphone. Her face was flushed, and she was sweating under the bright stage lights, desperately trying to project her usual righteous authority. She was right in the middle of spinning her spectacular web of lies, telling the congregation how God had blessed them with a billionaire debt holder who was close personal friends with her brilliant executive son-in-law. She promised the crowd that the church mortgage was going to be completely forgiven tonight, all because of her family's immense faithful standing in the corporate world. The board of elders nodded along, completely blind to the fact that their head of finance had gambled the literal house of God on a bad stock tip. I walked slowly and deliberately down the center aisle. The heavy midnight blue silk of my custom designer gown brushed against the carpeted floor, and the massive diamond collar around my neck caught the blinding glare of the chandeliers above. A quiet ripple of confusion and awe spread through the ballroom as people turned in their chairs to look at me. I did not stop until I reached the steps of the main stage. I walked up the stairs, my Italian stilettos clicking sharply against the polished wood. Geraldine froze mid-sentence, her eyes bulging out of her head as she finally recognized the glittering, majestic woman approaching her. The microphone trembled in her manicured hand. Before she could even formulate a single word, I stepped right into her personal space and firmly pulled the microphone from her frozen fingers. Marcus and my private security team smoothly stepped up behind me, completely blocking Geraldine from interfering. I stood at the center of the stage, looking out over the sea of confused faces, and spoke into the microphone. My voice was calm, steady, and carried the absolute chilling authority of someone who owned the very ground they were sitting on. I introduced myself to the congregation not as the pathetic line cook or the family disappointment, but as the anonymous owner and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. A collective gasp echoed through the massive ballroom. I raised my hand and signaled the audiovisual booth at the back of the room. The massive projection screen directly behind the altar flared to life, illuminating the stage. Displayed for every single elder and pastor to see was the unredacted legal deed to the massive church property, clearly showing Apex Holdings as the sole owner of their debt. But I was not finished. The next slide flashed onto the screen, displaying the private, unredacted financial records of the church operating accounts right alongside Spencer S. failing brokerage accounts. I looked out at the horrified congregation and exposed everything. I told them that my mother, your head of finance, mortgaged Big Mama Ruby's house and stole from this congregation to fund fake luxury. I explained clearly and ruthlessly how she had wired hundreds of thousands of dollars of the Sanctuary Expansion Fund directly to her son-in-law to cover his toxic day trading losses. The entire ballroom erupted into absolute total outrage. People were jumping out of their chairs, shouting and pointing at the stage. The senior pastor, whose face had turned a dangerous shade of purple, stormed up the steps of the stage. He did not care about Geraldine's pride or her fake religious standing. He grabbed the backup microphone and demanded her immediate resignation on the spot, screaming over the noise of the crowd that the federal authorities were being called right this second. Geraldine collapsed to her knees on the polished stage, weeping real violent tears of absolute terror as her entire carefully curated empire burned to ashes in front of the entire city. The doors at the back of the ballroom suddenly burst open, and Ebony pushed her way through the chaotic, screaming crowd. She had just witnessed her husband being dragged off the red carpet by security, and she was looking completely manic and unhinged. She rushed toward the stage, her cheap rented gown tearing as she scrambled up the steps. She pointed a shaking finger at my face and screamed over the noise of the outraged congregation. "You are a monster!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with selfish, hysterical panic. "You ruined my life." I just looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing for the woman who had spent my entire existence making me feel like garbage. I calmly raised my hand and gestured to the certified process server who had been waiting quietly in the wings of the ballroom. The man in the plain gray suit walked directly onto the stage, ignoring the screaming church elders, and handed Ebony a thick, heavy manila folder right there in front of hundreds of people. She stared at it, her hands shaking violently. "That is your formal eviction notice, Ebony," I said, my voice echoing cleanly through the microphone, cutting through her hysterical sobbing. "Your luxury car has already been towed from the valet stand outside." I stepped closer to her, lowering the microphone so only she could hear the absolute finality in my voice. "You have no money, you have no husband with a job, and you have no house." She stared at the legal documents in her hands, her chest heaving as the suffocating reality of her total financial annihilation finally set in. "You have exactly what you gave me at 15, I whispered coldly. "Nothing." I stepped down from the podium and walked right up to my trembling sister. I reached out my hands and grabbed the heavy strand of authentic pearls resting against her neck. They were Big Mama Ruby-S pearls, the only valuable thing our grandmother had left behind, the heirloom. Ebony had stolen simply because she felt she deserved them more than anyone else. I unclasped the heavy jewelry with a swift, decisive motion, pulling the smooth pearls away from her skin. "These belong to me," I said. Ebony's knees gave out, and she fell to the floor of the stage, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands as the congregation continued to shout and the police sirens began to wail in the distance. I turned my back on the pathetic wreckage of my toxic family and walked off the stage, my diamond collar catching the light one last time before I exited the building. 1 month later, the dust had finally settled over the absolute destruction of their fake reality. Geraldine was sitting in a cheap, dingy motel room right off the interstate, smelling of stale cigarette smoke and cheap bleach. Her pristine suburban house was gone, seized by the bank to cover a fraction of her massive debts. She was facing multiple federal wire fraud and embezzlement charges, and the church she had spent decades manipulating had completely turned their backs on her. There were no fancy prayer circles for her, no sympathetic lawyers working pro bono. She was staring down the barrel of a 5 to 10-year federal prison sentence, and she was entirely, completely alone. Ebony and Spencer were in the middle of a vicious, toxic bankruptcy. The eviction had gone through exactly as planned, forcing them into a cramped, dirty studio apartment where they spent every waking hour screaming and blaming each other for their total collapse. Their fake plastic marriage, which was built entirely on a foundation of luxury cars and stolen money, instantly dissolved the moment the bank accounts hit zero. The divorce papers had already been filed, but neither of them had the money to pay the filing fees. I sat in my penthouse, listening to the pathetic, desperate voicemails they kept leaving on the cheap burner phone. I still kept in my desk. Geraldine was begging and weeping, asking me to hire her a high-powered defense attorney, claiming that she was still my mother and that God would judge me for abandoning her. Ebony left manic, sobbing messages begging for a temporary loan just to get a hotel room away from Spencer's toxic meltdowns. Spencer left pathetic, slurring voicemails that swung wildly between begging for his corporate job back and crying about his ruined reputation. I sat in the quiet luxury of my office, listening to their voices echo in the massive room. I did not feel an ounce of guilt or a single shred of pity. They were simply facing the absolute natural consequences of their own malicious greed. I selected all the messages and hit delete, wiping their voices away forever before tossing the burner phone directly into the trash can. The late afternoon sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of gold and orange as I sat back in a heavy wooden rocking chair. I was not in my glass penthouse today. I was sitting on the wide wraparound porch of Big Mama Ruby's house. The entire property had been meticulously restored to its former glory. The peeling paint was replaced with a warm, welcoming yellow, and the sagging roof was entirely rebuilt. Jamal sat in the rocking chair right next to me, laughing softly as we watched the street. In the distance, the low rumble of heavy diesel engines echoed through the neighborhood. Two of Jamal's brand-new shining logistics trucks were driving down the main avenue, heading out to fulfill massive, lucrative commercial contracts. His business was thriving beyond his wildest dreams, funded by the anonymous venture capital investment he had earned through his own sheer brilliance and unbreakable work ethic. He looked healthier, happier, and completely free from the heavy, crushing weight of our family as toxic expectations. I reached up and gently touched the smooth, cool surface of Big Mama Ruby's pearls resting securely around my neck. They felt exactly right, exactly where they belonged. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened my secure banking application. The screen illuminated, displaying a verified liquid balance of exactly $120 million. I looked at the impossible number, feeling the absolute solid weight of my own unbreakable security. I closed the application, locked the screen, and took a slow, satisfying sip of my ice-cold sweet tea. Family isn't a blood. Family is the person who drives 200 miles with their last $50 to make sure you can breathe. I didn't destroy them. I just stopped paying for their illusions. The most powerful lesson from this story is that true strength does not require volume. It requires methodical preparation and an unwavering belief in your own worth. For years, her toxic family mistook her silence for weakness and her humility for failure. They built their fragile empires on stolen money and loud arrogance, completely blind to the fact that she was silently building an untouchable fortress of genuine power. Blood does not automatically guarantee loyalty, and you are under no obligation to finance the delusions of people who continuously disrespect you. Sometimes your greatest revenge is simply letting them fall. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your peace, share your story in the comments below.